Alright, today we're going to go over Chapter 13, which is titled The Sections Go Their Own Ways. So the South is going to be less affected than other regions by urbanization, European immigration, the transportation revolution, and industrialization. The South remained predominantly agricultural, however, the cultivation of cotton and tobacco expanded westward, while the older sections of Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina diversified their agriculture. Experiments with fertilizers, crop rotation, agricultural implements and practices, and new varieties of crops helped improve agricultural productivity. The increased importance of cotton in the South's economy strengthened slavery's hold on the region. The price of slaves increased, particularly in the Deep South, that area along the Gulf Coast, and slave trading became a big business. The slave trade had disastrous effects on slaves. Families were often separated. In fact, about 1/3 of every marriage ended in separation. As slaves became more expensive, ownership of slaves became more concentrated. By 1860, only 25% of Southern families owned any slaves. Relatively speaking, the South had few large plantations and many small farms. Small farms grew staple crops and owned few slaves. Plantations could yield high profits, but Southerners did not develop facilities for marketing or transportation. The profit from handling the crop went largely to Northern merchants and middlemen. Southern capital was tied up in land and slaves and therefore was not available for investment in other things. Under slavery, Southern blacks remained a non-consuming class, and much of the intelligence, talent, and abilities of the slave population were wasted. This map can be found on page 282 in your book. And basically it's just showing you the area of greatest cotton production or also the areas of the highest proportion of slaves in the population. So if you look kind of right in the middle of this map, all those red dots, that represents 2,000 bales of cotton. And the greener the area is, the more slaves are concentrated in that area. So if you look like far west Texas, you'll notice that it's less than 10% slaves make up that population because they're not producing as much cotton. So it goes hand in hand. The more cotton you have, the more slaves you have in that area. The typical antebellum plantation was more like a small village than a northern farm. Planters bought luxuries and manufactured goods, but plantations produced most household needs and nearly all the food consumed. Typically it was grown in gardens, and tended to by the slaves. The master exercised paternal authority over the plantation. His wife had immense domestic responsibilities. She ran the household, supervised slaves, nursed the sick, planned meals, and saw the education of her children as well as the training of young slaves. At the same time, she played the role of a refined, gracious Southern lady. Most slaves worked in the field, but others were employed as household servants and artisans on the plantation. Though simple and crude, slave quarters compared favorably with houses of European peasants. It's difficult to generalize about slavery because so much depended on the individual's master's behavior. Most owners, they did provide adequate food, clothing, and shelter for their slaves because they were seen as very valuable property. Still, slaves had a higher rate of infant mortality and a lower life expectancy than whites, typically 5 years less. On the other hand, the United States was the only slave society in the Western Hemisphere whose slave population grew by natural increase. Masters often felt a sense of responsibility toward slaves, but also acted very cruelly. Fears and resentment existed on both sides. Whatever their material condition, slaves had no rights. For their part, slaves accommodated themselves to the system while attempting to resist oppression through their own institutions, such as marriage, religion, and community. Rebellions like that under Nat Turner remain the exception. The peculiar institution hardened as Northern opposition to slavery grew and Southerners worried about insurrection. Slavery remained an essentially rural institution, and its existence contributed to the royal nature of the South. Not all blacks in the South were slaves, however. By the time we get to the Civil War, there's about 200 free African Americans living in the South. In Texas. White Southerners took a dim view of free blacks and restricted their freedom by enacting what are known as black codes, and they are very similar to slave codes or slave laws. If you'll recall in your book, there's a story of a woman, I believe she's from South Carolina, who beat her slave to death, and the only punishment she received was she had to pay a fine. Now, on the other hand, if a slave had killed their master, usually their punishment after being tortured was death. So you can see it's a double standard in the South and for slaves. This is a quote by John C. Calhoun. Remember Crazy Eyes? He was the gentleman whose wife started the petticoat affair with Peggy Eaton. This is what he stated in defense of slavery. I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences as well as intellectual are brought together, the relation now existing in the slave-holding states between the two is instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. And this is a quote from the Louisiana slave law. It states, "A slave owes his master respect without bounds and an absolute obedience." Now, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Bible, and you can see where they are drawing these parallels between slavery in the Bible and slavery in the South. And if we recall, there's a couple of key verses that Southerners are going to use in defense of slavery, and this is one of those where you can see it seems like they're borrowing from the Bible. Owes his master respect without bounds and an absolute obedience. That's almost verbatim what the Bible says about how slaves should treat their masters. This is a picture of a woman from the Congo that was captured. Now, the slave trade supposedly had been abolished. International slave trade had been abolished in 1808, but she's caught after 1808. It's estimated that about 50,000 West Africans were actually sold into slavery after the slave trade had supposedly ended. And then this is a painting of a slave burial service from 1860. It reflects this inversion of power relations. You can see the slave preacher here in the middle is leading the mourners while the white overseers are back in the far right-hand corner in the tree line. They watched very uneasily out to the outskirts, kind of to the sides, and they did this on purpose. They were afraid that if slaves were able to get together in large groups like this, then they would plan an uprising or rebellion. So there's always a white or a group of whites that was there to oversee and make sure nothing extra legal was going on with the slaves. This is just a chart for you guys to look at the slave revolts that did take place between 1712 and 1831. These are the big ones. Now, there are a couple of other small ones that did happen, but you can see in your book and read about these, you know, who led it, the year, the description, what happened to the slaves, and then also laws that came out of these slave uprising rebellions. With few exceptions, such as Denmark Vesey, most slaves appear to resign to their fate. The system fosters submissiveness and discourages independent judgment and self-reliance on the part of the blacks. In spite of this, slaves maintained strong family and group attachments as well as a culture of their own. Slavery had a detrimental impact on poor Southerners who associated working for others with civility. Slavery inevitably affected the master class as well. The patriarchal nature of the slave system reinforced male dominance in Southern society. Some slave owners behaved nobly with the confines of the institution. For others, slaves provided objects on which to vent brutal tendencies. Although the temper of Southern society discouraged businesses and commercial activities, considerable manufacturing developed. Small flour and lumber mills as well as iron and coal mining flourished. The availability of raw materials and water power led to the development of textile manufacturing. However, the Southern textile industry remained insignificant compared with that of the North. Less than 15% of all goods manufactured in the United States in 1860 came from the South, and the region depended on the North for most of its manufactured goods. Northern society placed a premium on resourcefulness and encouraged experimentation, and industry in that region grew rapidly in the decades before the Civil War. The factory system made great strides, and a shortage of skilled labor led businessmen to substitute machines for trained hands. Industrial growth increased the demand for labor, and an increase in immigration helped fill that demand. Skilled artisans earned good wages, but machinery made skills less important, and the wages for an unskilled worker could barely support a family. Immigration provided an expanding workforce, and European investors provided capital necessary for economic expansion. Relatively high per capita wealth provided a market for consumer goods. American industry displayed a remarkable receptivity to technological change and led the world in the manufacture of goods that required the use of precision instruments as early as 1850. American gun manufacturers impressed foreign observers with their automatic machine-produced metalware, so much so that they wanted to take the technology back to Europe, which remember, right when we began our industry here and we were trying to build our factories, remember Europe wouldn't share the blueprints with us, but now they want in on how we're able to do these precision instruments and how we're able to manufacture so well and so quickly. Immigration further stimulated industrialization in the northern states. Most immigrants came from Germany, Ireland, Britain, and Scandinavia. Immigrants were drawn to the prospect of abundant land, good wages, and economic opportunity. These pull factors that we were pulling them to the United States. Others sought religious or political freedom. Those would be push factors. And then the Irish, they're going to have a push factor of the potato famine to migrate because they were trying to avoid starvation. In the long run, immigration is going to stimulate the American economy. Here is just some maps for you. These are found on page 291. So during the Irish potato famine from 1845 to 1851, about 1 million Irish people died and another 1 million immigrated to the United States. This first map with the red counties shows the western counties of Ireland were the poorest, and more than half of the residents there were receiving public relief as paupers. The second map shows that during these years, tens of thousands flooded into Dublin, the largest city in Ireland. The greatest population losses were in the poor western regions of Ireland. And the crazy thing is, after this huge migration, we're actually going to have more Irish descendants living in the United States than in Ireland. Native-born workers who resented immigrants for their willingness to accept low wages looked down on immigrants, many of whom developed prejudices of their own. For example, the Irish often disliked African Americans with whom they competed for work. The arrival of unskilled immigrants created economic disruptions. The growth of urban populations produced slums. Wives and children of male factory workers had to work in the factories to survive. In early factory towns, most working families found additional means of improving their diets, but industrial slums made this difficult, requiring children to work on ever faster machinery in factory settings. The Depression of the late 1830s led to the demise of early working men's political parties and unions. Nonetheless, conditions for skilled workers improved in the 1840s and 1850s. The working day did grow shorter, and most states actually enacted mechanics' lien laws, and a Massachusetts court established the legality of labor unions in Commonwealth versus Hunt, 1842. Unionism remained local and weak, however, in part because skilled workers looked down on unskilled workers, and few laborers considered themselves part of a permanent working class. Although the United States was a democratic land of opportunity with an expanding economy, few class distinctions, and a comparatively high standard of living, there existed a large class of poor, unskilled, mostly immigrant laborers who were materially less well off than most Southern slaves. The middle-class majority was largely indifferent or unaware of their plight. Even though we did have some reformers that were trying to help, the gap between the rich and the poor widened and society became more stratified. This is a painting in your book. This is a painting of 800 women shoemakers in Lynn, Massachusetts around 1860. In 1851, a Lynn shoemaker had adapted a new sewing machine so that it could pierce and sew leather, and this work was traditionally performed by married women in their homes. So they didn't have to go out, they could stay at home, watch their kids, attend to the domestic affairs of the house. But with this new adapted sewing machine, it required women to leave their homes and children to work at the shoe stitching factories, and few married women would do so. Here they are protesting their displacement. So there's a second video that finishes up the rest of this chapter. It's going to be a little bit shorter, but make sure you look at part 2 of chapter 13 in order to get a review for the entire chapter.